Well, welcome to North Shore, everybody, in Kirkland and Mill Creek, and to all of you who are joining us online. I'm speaking today from the original North Shore Sanctuary. Now, if you've been on our Kirkland campus, you may know this as our in-kids elementary space, but for the first 20 years of our church's history, this is where people gathered for worship. It looked a little different back then, but the original stained glass windows are still on the wall. There's even an old baptismal under the stage. I didn't even know it was there until like a few weeks ago. You know, so much ministry has happened in this space. But if these walls could talk, they wouldn't just be able to tell you about all the lives that have been changed or the friendships that have been made. They'd also be able to tell you about all the marriages that have started right here in this room. Over the past 54 years, hundreds of couples have stood on that stage, expressed their love, taken their vows, all surrounded by friends and family at this amazing celebration that has basically bankrupted their parents. In fairy tales, this is where the great love stories always end, at the wedding. They begin in the same way when once upon a time, two people fall madly in love, overcome all the obstacles in their way, and then at the end, they get married and live, and you know the words, happily ever after. I mean, isn't that what happened to Cinderella and Prince Charming, and Snow White and Prince Charming, and Sleeping Beauty and Prince Charming? By the way, does anyone else think Prince Charming should just pick somebody? Sounds like kind of a sleaze to me. But in real life, love stories don't end here. This is just the beginning. And what comes next is not always happily ever after. I mean, every couple that has said I do at some point faces challenges, miscommunication, disappointment, and even loss of trust. So what about the stories when happily isn't ever after? When once upon a time there was a husband who found out that his wife had been unfaithful. Or once upon a time there was a husband who was verbally abusive and a wife who felt like no one would believe her, so she never said anything. Or once upon a time there was a couple who looked so perfect on the outside, but behind closed doors there was strife, tension, lack of love. Now, maybe if you're married, your marriage is different. Maybe you have a perfect marriage. Maybe you're the perfect spouse. Maybe you always have the perfect attitude. Maybe you never fight about the dirty dishes or the toothpaste tube or if the toilet paper should go this way or that way when the Bible clearly says it should go this way. But for most people, marriage can be really messy. Love stories that begin with great hope and expectation can struggle, grow cold, and even fail. You know, the divorce rate in this country is a much debated statistic, but we know that 25% of the adults in this country have been through a divorce. That's 1 out of 4. And that number doesn't include the marriages that are in crisis or couples that have simply drifted apart over time. And here's the other thing. While the church is a great place for a wedding, it can be a really hard place for people who are struggling in their marriage. Just like it can be a hard place for people who aren't married, because there can be this assumption in churches that good people have great marriages. So then, if you're not married or you have problems in your marriage, that must say something not so good about you, right? But the truth is, Jesus never said there are good people who have great marriages and then bad people who don't. He said that faithfulness in marriage, just like faithfulness in singleness, is really about your heart. And he invited people, whether single, married, or divorced, into something even better than happily ever after. Which brings us back to the series we're in called Change of Heart. As most of you know, we're spending this entire year walking through what's called the Sermon on the Mount. And we're in that section of the sermon where Jesus shifts from speaking about his blessings to our problems. But not the problems that we face out there in the world, but the problems we face on the inside. Jesus started with anger, and then he turned to lust and mismanaged sexual desire. But remember, he's not creating new rules. He's actually challenging the assumption that following rules is what makes you a righteous person. To which Jesus said, no. Righteousness is about what's going on in your heart. And so now he's going to call out another law that people in his day were kind of using to say, yep, I checked that box. I'm doing okay. I'm a righteous person. And this time, it's all about marriage and divorce. So this is from Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 31. Jesus says, "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. Now, I'll pause here for a moment, just so you know. This certificate of divorce was a huge moral leap forward in the ancient world. Because in every other culture outside of Israel, a husband could basically leave his wife at any time and for any reason. And not only that, he could decide to come back and reclaim her at any time and for any reason, which made it extremely unlikely that she would be able to remarry. So unless she had sons who were old enough to work or relatives who could take her in, she would be left to basically beg in the streets or even be forced into prostitution. The one nation where this was not allowed was Israel. In fact, the Torah, the Old Testament law, required a husband to give his wife this certificate of divorce, which would confirm that the marriage was over and allow her to remarry. In fact, the phrase, "you are free to marry any Jewish man you wish," appears on almost every surviving divorce certificate from that time. The problem is, this certificate that was created to protect women had become a way to basically justify men, because in Jesus' day, husbands who wanted to leave their wives could just say, "Hey, as long as I give her that certificate, I'm doing what God wants. I'm still righteous." And so Jesus once again challenges this righteousness by keeping a rule and says, no, this is about your heart. So back to our text again. Jesus says, "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Now, this raises lots of questions. I mean, is getting remarried really the same as adultery? And is infidelity the only biblical grounds for divorce? I mean, what about situations where there's abuse or neglect? Well, to answer those questions, we need to first take a step back and look at Jesus' understanding of marriage and his context, as well as the context around divorce in that day. So for the rest of this message, I'm going to make a series of statements about marriage and divorce, and then ask you if you think they are true or false. And then we'll unpack each one together. So here we go. First statement. God intends marriage to be a lifelong commitment. True or false? Well, that's true. In the Bible, marriage is modeled after what's called a covenant, which was a binding promise or contract made between two people or between God and another person. And with marriage, it was actually both. It was a promise made before God and to another person to love, honor, and cherish for better or for worse, as long as we both shall live. And it was created to be a picture of what God's love for us is really like, faithful, unwavering, and permanent. In fact, the writer of Genesis describes the first marriage this way. It says, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." Now, to leave one's father and mother implies a permanent shift from one family to another, and to cleave just means to join with or stick to, which means getting married isn't as much a declaration of love in the present, it's a promise to love and keep loving in the future, for better or for worse. I have a good friend who was once officiating a wedding, and at the end, he forgot to have the couple kiss before he sent them back down the aisle. And afterwards, they were just heartbroken, saying, what about the kiss? We need to kiss. And are we even married if we didn't kiss? And so my friend reassured them, yes, you're married. A kiss is not what makes you married. Your commitment does. And he was right. No one else ever asked him to officiate their wedding, but he was right. You see, God created marriage to be a lifelong commitment. But of course, for a lot of people, this whole concept sounds more like wishful thinking. Maybe you've been through a divorce. Maybe your parents are divorced. Maybe you're having problems in your marriage and you're thinking, are we the only ones who are struggling with some of this stuff? Which brings me to another true-false statement, and it's this. All the marriages in the Bible are perfect model marriages. True or false? Ooh, that's false. Think about Abraham and Sarah. Abraham basically pawned off Sarah to an Egyptian pharaoh just to save his own life. And Sarah made Abraham sleep with another woman so they could try to have a child. Not exactly a model marriage. Or how about Jacob, who fell in love with a woman named Rachel, but he was tricked by Rachel's father into marrying Rachel's sister, Leah. But he still wanted to marry Rachel, so he married them both in consecutive weeks. Sounds more like The Bachelor than the Bible. Or how about David and Bathsheba? Don't even get me started on how those two got together, or how David tried to cover it up, or how much pain this caused Bathsheba and their kids. The truth is, married couples in the Bible started having problems as early as the very first one. when Adam and Eve turned against God and they turned to blaming one another and hiding. They felt shame and the need to cover themselves. And of course, they had huge issues with their kids. Ever heard of Cain and Abel? And within a few generations, polygamy became the norm. Women were being treated as property and were often victims of infidelity or abandonment. And so God, in his grace, decided to do something about this. Which brings me to another true-false statement, and it's this. The Bible includes provisions for divorce to protect the victims of marital unfaithfulness. True or false? Well, that's true. Yes, God created marriage to be a lifelong commitment, but he also gave us free will, which means we can keep or break those commitments. And just like God has compassion for the victims of poverty or injustice, God has compassion for the victims of broken marriage commitments. In fact, the Bible explicitly allows for divorce in cases of infidelity, abuse, abandonment, and neglect. For example, I'm going to read you a passage from Scripture. This is from Exodus 21. It says, if a man marries another woman, and remember, polygamy was still being practiced in those days, so this is about a man taking a second wife. But if a man marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these three things, she is to go free without any payment of money. So why is this important? Because it makes it clear that the Bible allows for divorce, not just when there was infidelity, but when there was abandonment or neglect, because that was breaking the vow to provide. Or when there was physical or verbal abuse, because that was breaking the vow to love. See, divorce was never God's hope for marriage, but it is God's gracious way of giving the victims of broken marriage vows a way forward in life. Which then leads to our next true-false statement. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is creating a new law that restricts divorce only to situations where there is sexual infidelity. True or false? Well, that's actually false. Now, it might sound true because Jesus said, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery. You remember those words? But this isn't just a random statement or new law. Jesus is actually speaking into a widely debated topic from his day. So I want to try to paint this picture for you, so try to bear with me as we walk through this. But just a few decades before the life of Jesus, there was a Jewish rabbi named Hillel the Elder. And Hillel went back to the Old Testament law on divorce, specifically Deuteronomy 24:1, which says, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and that refers to sexual immorality, he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and then sends her from his house. Now, Hillel claimed that the text wasn't just saying a man could divorce his wife for a cause of sexual immorality, but for any cause, including sexual immorality. Do you see the difference? There was actually a technical term for this new practice. It was called an any-cause divorce. And it meant the husband didn't need to take his wife to court or prove anything. He didn't need to prove that she had broken her vows. She could have simply talked too loud or burned the toast, and the husband could simply write her that certificate, and it was a done deal. By the way, this is almost what happened in the Christmas story. You may remember when Joseph is told that Mary is pregnant, we're told that Joseph did not want to expose Mary to public disgrace, and so he was going to divorce her quietly. Now, quietly didn't mean he was going to whisper it to her in her ear. It meant he would divorce her without going to court, and the only way he could have done that would be able to use this any-cause divorce. Now, of course, as you know, an angel came to him in a dream and told him not to do this. But by the time Jesus was an adult, this any-cause divorce was the standard practice of the day. But not every rabbi agreed with this. In fact, there's another famous rabbi named Rabbi Shammai who claimed that Hillel was wrong. He said this text in Deuteronomy didn't refer to any cause, including sexual immorality, but to just a cause of sexual immorality, which then sparked this huge debate amongst the rabbis and teachers of the law in that day. In fact, they would test each other publicly by asking, does the law in Deuteronomy say any cause, or is it just sexual immorality? Not, again, to dismiss the other grounds for divorce. Both rabbis knew the law allowed for divorce in cases of abandonment, abuse, and neglect. The debate was all about how to interpret this verse in Deuteronomy. And wouldn't you know it, one of those teachers who was brought into this debate was Jesus himself. I'm going to read it to you. This is from Matthew 19. The text says, some Pharisees came to him to test him. Here we go. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? This is not a random question. This is about any cause divorce. They're asking, are you on Team Hillel or Team Shammai? And Jesus said, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Now, without knowing all the context, it sure sounds like Jesus is saying that unless there's been sexual infidelity, you have no biblical grounds for divorce, even if there's been abuse or neglect or abandonment. But once you know the reason Jesus was asked this question and what was being debated in that day, it's actually quite clear Jesus was just saying, hey, I'm on Team Shammai, not Team Hillel. And there are two really significant implications of this. First, if there's a marriage where there's ongoing, unrepentant abuse or neglect, it is not a sin to get a divorce. Remember, the Bible allows for divorce to protect the victims of marital unfaithfulness, whether it's infidelity or abuse or abandonment or neglect. No stigma, no shame, no saying, well, now you're damaged goods. Just a gracious way to find safety and a second chance. That's the first implication. The second implication is that Jesus is also directly rejecting the practice of divorce for any reason or any cause. And he's directly rejecting the idea that marriage is just about compatibility. And divorce is just really a way to find someone with whom I'm a little more compatible. Now, of course, it's really important to choose a spouse who shares your values, beliefs, priorities, expectations, especially when it comes to faith in Jesus. But it sure doesn't take long after you take your vows and you walk out of a room like this to think, wait a minute, I'm not sure the two of us are compatible at all. He likes to sleep in and I want to get up early. She likes to talk before going to bed and I just want to go to sleep. He likes it really cold in the house. I want the house to feel like the Sahara Desert. You know, I love how the writer G.K. Chesterton put it. He once wrote this, I have known many happy marriages, but never a compatible one. The whole aim of marriage is to fight through and survive the instant when incompatibility becomes unquestionable. And at some point in every marriage, incompatibility will become unquestionable. And part of the journey and the beauty and the challenge and the gift of marriage is working through these differences and disagreements. It's recognizing that God made this other person, and my job is not just to be in love with them, but to love them, even when I don't feel in love with them. And that kind of love means being willing to listen, compromise, put their needs first. It means being remorseful when you've messed up and offering forgiveness when they mess up. And let me just say from experience, this is really hard work. I mean, it's easy to get married, but staying married will take every fiber of your character. This will reveal every aspect of your pride, your ego. But here's the thing, it's such good work. It's so worth it because marriage at the end of the day isn't fundamentally about happiness. It's about growth. Let me say that again. Marriage isn't fundamentally about happiness. It's about growth. I know that's not as romantic. It's not something you should write on a Valentine's card. Trust me, I tried it once. Wasn't pretty. But God created marriage not to please you, but to grow you. Now, that doesn't mean we should gloss over sin or selfishness or bad behavior, nor does it mean that some marriages don't need to end. For example, if a spouse has broken their vows or there's been an ongoing pattern of deceit or neglect, and their response is repeated denial, avoidance, or an unwillingness to get help or make a change, Jesus is saying divorce, while tragic, may be necessary, even needed. But if there's a willingness to repent, a desire to change, an openness to getting help, then Jesus calls us to pursue forgiveness and try to preserve the marriage, even if it's hard, even if you don't want to, even if it feels easier to just walk away. Why? Because God is in the resurrection business, and He knows how to bring dead things back to life. Which leads to another true-false statement, and it's this: there's still hope for every marriage. True or false? Oh, that's so true. I mean, if God can raise the dead, He can restore a marriage no matter how broken it may seem. I have a friend whose marriage got so bad, he and his wife told their counselor, we give up. This just isn't going to work. But by the grace of God, they kept working, persevering, repenting, forgiving. They got help from a great counselor. By the way, far too many married couples wait too long to get help or counseling. But they got the help that they needed, and God built a whole new marriage out of the remnants of a deeply broken one. Because as long as two people are open to the ways they are both contributing to the challenges in their marriage, there's always hope. So if your marriage is in a really hard place, keep working on it. And if your marriage is doing okay, here's the thing. Keep working on it. Invest in it. Bring your best to it. Make time for it. I have learned the hard way what happens when you don't. There's lots of pain and struggle. And if you've been through a divorce or are currently facing a divorce, I have one more true-false statement I want to make, and it's this. There's still hope on the other side of divorce. True or false? True. Yes, divorce is painful. Yes, it can cause a lot of damage, but divorce is not an unforgivable sin. God can forgive broken marriage vows just like he can forgive greed or resentment. He just needs you to come to him and own your part of why the marriage failed and be willing to ask for forgiveness, and then there's grace. And not only that, here at North Shore, there's a community that's here to welcome you in like family. I mean, this is a place where it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to be struggling in your marriage or be in recovery from a broken one. In fact, there's an amazing divorce care ministry here at North Shore, and the current session just started last week, so you can jump in this week. And the information's online, or ask someone on our team about it. And by the way, if you know someone who has or is going through a divorce, don't try to determine who's guilty or innocent. I mean, it's really difficult to judge what's going on in a marriage that you're not in. And every marriage, guess what, is between two great big sinners, which means it's never only one person's fault. And that's not to say we shouldn't try to hold each other accountable, but we can so easily fall into this trap of thinking, there are good married people in the room, and then there are bad divorced people in the room. But the truth is, there are just sinners in the room, and a God who is really good at redeeming sin. In fact, the man who led me back to Christ when I was in college, the man who I call my pastor, has been through a divorce. His first wife left him after seminary, so he left ministry, went back to grad school thinking, it's over, God can't use me anymore. But God did. And my life is proof of that. And if that doesn't challenge your thinking, you know who else has been through a divorce? God has. Remember, God made a covenant with his people. He made a promise to be faithful, for better or for worse. But then we turned to other gods, other desires, and so God said, I gave faithless Israel her certificate of divorce and sent her away because of all her adulteries. You see, the reason the Bible says God hates divorce is because God has been through one. He knows the pain of betrayal and the humiliation of rejection. But then, in response, God created this amazing divorce recovery program called the cross, where broken vows can be forgiven and broken hearts can be healed. And here's the thing, we all need it. Because at the end of the day, we've all been unfaithful in marriage or in singleness, sexually, relationally, spiritually. We all fall short. But thank God, the greatest love story ever isn't about some prince or princess who fall in love once upon a time. It's about the God who so loved this world that he came and gave his life for unfaithful, vow-breaking people like you and like me. And instead of leaving us alone and broken, he came back to us with what the Bible calls a new covenant, which is like a new marriage, or better yet, a second chance. And that's what God can give you right now, a second chance. Whatever relational mess you may find yourself in, whatever the state of your marriage if you're married, Jesus can give you a second chance to get things right in here. And so we're going to spend some time together with Jesus right now.